Welcome to Herb Gardening Extending the Season. This is a continuation of Preparing Your Herb Gardening for Success course that we did in 2019. So if you haven't taken that masterclass, I want you to pause this video and go and enroll in Preparing Your Herb Garden for Success first, because this masterclass builds on what you learn in that one. So if you've never taken Preparing Your Herb Garden for Success, I want you to go back, pause this video, go back and enroll in that class and do the 4 modules in that class first, and then come and resume this one. In that class, you learned how to start seeds. You learned about companion planting using herbs. You learned about seed saving, and you'll learn about preparing your herb garden. In this one, we're going to specifically talk about how to change the climate in your own garden so that you can grow things that maybe you couldn't grow before. Gardening 201, Extending the Season. In this module, we're going to start by talking about soil fertility. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to increase the organic matter in your soil, how to create the perfect soil conditions for quick growth, which soil amendments you should add each spring for gardening success, and also how to use biochar for long-term fertility in your garden. And we're going to not just talk about herb gardening, but we're also going to talk about vegetable gardening, because what you put in your body, whether you're putting in herbs or vegetables, is very important for your health. Soil quality is the #1 factor that determines plant growth and also determines how healthy the vegetables, fruits, and herbs that you grow actually are. Healthy soil, rich in organic matter, microorganisms, and earthworms is the goal of all organic gardeners. Soil structure is also important. Soil should be light, friable, and non-compacted for best drainage and plant growth. The ideal garden soil is 5% organic matter. So you're going to hear organic gardeners harp on organic matter, but it actually only makes up 5% of the soil, but it's pretty important. 45% is mineral content. Now that's phosphorus, sodium, potassium, those kinds of things, as well as trace minerals. And then it's 25% water and 25% air. So as you can see, 50% of your garden soil is actually just water and air. Of these 4 constituents, the mineral content of soil and the organic matter provide essential nutrients for plant growth. The organic matter in the soil is the easiest to manipulate. In ideal soil, there will be about 6 pounds of organic matter, dry weight, per cubic foot of soil. There are some ways that you can improve the organic matter in your soil and also the soil structure. You can add worm castings, you can add compost, you can add organic mulch, you can do lasagna gardening, which is like creating compost, only you do it right in the garden bed. You can create cover crops. That would be like planting in between growing your vegetables. You would plant things like clover or alfalfa to put more nitrogen in the soil. Sometimes fall rye is planted, also to put more nitrogen in the soil. Using no-till management practices also improves soil structure, because when you till, you're actually breaking apart the soil. And as we go into this module a little further, you're going to understand even more about why no-till is a better way to grow vegetables than to get that rototiller out every spring. Crop rotation. So let's talk about how to make compost. Every single organic gardener should understand this. When you make compost, you need to use 30 parts of carbon and only 1 part of nitrogen. Carbon is the brown stuff, the dry stuff. So that could be fallen leaves, that could be branches, that could be straw, newspaper, cardboard. Those are all carbon, the dry part. And then nitrogen is things like green leaves or grass clippings or weeds, vegetable plants. The reason you want 30 parts carbon and 1 part nitrogen is that's the ideal ratio to get your compost pile to heat up and start the decomposition. If you've got too much nitrogen, let's say it's all grass clippings and there's no carbon, what happens is it starts to get really, really hot, and it can actually catch fire. If you've ever made a pile of grass clippings in your yard after mowing the lawn, and you go back a couple days later and you fork over the top, you might see some charring ash happening in the middle of the pile. as it overheats, and it can actually ignite. I know a farmer where I live where he made hay and it got a little damp and he baled it anyway, and he actually burned his barn down because the hay got overheated, because it's like hay is 100% nitrogen, there's no carbon, and it was a bit damp and it started to heat up like that, and it caught the bale on fire, and that caught other bales on fire. He lost his barn from the fire, and it was just because of this. If he had had 30 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen, it wouldn't have got that hot. And so, of course, if you're a haymaker, you know you always dry the hay down completely. You don't want very much moisture in hay. Otherwise, you can get to this point where it can spontaneously ignite. You want to break up large pieces. So if you have large roots or you have large branches with leaves, you want to break them up into smaller parts. So you might want to use a mulcher or a chipper. You might want to put dry leaves. You might want to go over them with a lawnmower. You might want to cut them with pruning shears. You want to break them up, because the smaller the branches or the smaller the pieces, the faster that can be consumed by bacteria. You'll find in the spring, if you don't break it up enough, the next spring or the next time you're turning it, those branches are like almost untouched. Then you want to add microbes, because decomposition happens 2 ways. One is it happens from red wiggler worms or composting worms. It might happen through insects like pill bugs and those kinds of things. And it also happens through microbes. Microbes get in there, and they thrive in the warmth that is created from that 30-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio. And we can actually add them in. Now, how do we add them in? Well, we can take a spoonful of previously finished compost and just dump it in the new pile. We can throw in some red wigglers to accelerate decomposition. We might also add a little bit of animal manure. And when I say animal manure, I mean farm animal manure, not dog or cat poop, but llama manure, rabbit manure, chicken or cow or horse manure into the pile. And then that also can help add those microbes to get it going. I already mentioned adding worms to accelerate the decomposition, and that also, adding worms will also increase the fertility of your finished compost because of the worm castings. And then about every 4 to 6 weeks, you want to keep your pile damp like a wrung out sponge, about that damp, because that helps the heat move through the pile and helps it to decompose. If you live in a warmer area, you might have finished compost by the end of the summer. If you live in a colder area like I do, it might take you 2 years for the compost to finish. If you don't turn it, if you turn it, you can still have finished compost by the next year. So the warmer your area, the faster your compost pile will turn into soil. So about every 4 to 6 weeks, you want to take a manure fork or a spading fork, and you just want to move that compost from one bin to the next bin. And if you do that every 4 to 6 weeks, after about 3 turns, you'll notice that it's becoming more like finished compost humus, and it will be much, much more like soil. You also want to keep it covered, because if you leave this out and expose it to rain, the rain's going to leach out quite a bit of that nitrogen. Nitrogen is water soluble, so you're going to lose quite a bit of the good nitrogen in that compost. And then when you put it on your garden, if you leave it exposed like that, you're not going to have the nitrogen. You're still going to have some structural benefit to your garden, but you won't have the nitrogen that you want to help your plants grow. That's how you make a compost in a bin. You can also do the same thing, but do it right into the garden. And to do that, you dig a trench. Now, this is a great way to start a brand new bed. So if you had a brand new place where you wanted to put a garden next year, anytime during the summer, you could dig a trench. And when I say a trench, I mean something about 1 foot to 1.5 feet deep. Not the French double digging that we used to do in the 1980s to make an organic garden. You just want to dig a shallow trench about 8 to 12 inches deep. Just put the dirt to the side, and then you want to fill it just like you would fill a compost bin with that 30-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio. And you want to build it up in layers. So you put a layer of newspaper or a layer of cardboard or a layer of paper shreddings or maybe some straw, some dry leaves. And then on top of that, you put a thinner layer of grass clippings or weeds or anything like that. Then you want to put another layer of the carbon-rich stuff, and then another layer of the nitrogen-rich stuff, and try to keep this 30-to-1 ratio, and top the whole thing off by adding a little bit of soil amendments in there. So you might add, we'll talk about that more later, but if you live near the sea, you could throw in some seaweed. My friends that live over near Vancouver Island, they would always go down to the beach in the spring and grab armloads of sea kelp and bring it home and just bury it in their garden like this. You might add red wigglers, you might add earthworms, you might add a little bit of kelp meal, a little bit of bone meal, things to get it going and to give more nutrients. Throw in some worms, cover the whole thing with newspaper, wet it all down, and then just walk away. That's all you need to do. If you live in an area that gets snow, by the next spring, that garden is going to be completely decomposed and ready to work in. And that 12 inches above the soil surface is going to be more at the soil surface, maybe just an inch. You're going to lose a lot as it composts down, and it will be perfect for planting in. Soil microorganisms are very important to plant growth. And that's something, when we rototill our gardens, that's something that we can damage. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. Again, this is an advanced gardening, which is why I wanted you to go back and do the preparing your herb garden for success first, because we're going to do a little bit of complicated talk about microbes and how they work in the soil, and a couple of very important types of fungi that are symbiotic to your plants that can actually increase the way your plants grow. Soil microorganisms form symbiotic relationships with plant roots, and they aid the plants in nutrient uptake, and also they help the plants be resilient to disease and to pests. Mushroom mycelium, mycorrhizal fungi are both important to soil health and to plant growth. You may have seen, if you do raised beds, there might be little brown mushrooms growing in your bed, and that might have frustrated you, and you might have wanted to rip them out. Or you might have turned over some soil that had bark mulch on top and noticed kind of a mold white thread going through. That's mushroom mycelium. Mushroom mycelium forms a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. Fungi give plants phosphorus and nitrogen from decaying organic matter that they're feeding off of. They also help retain moisture and nutrients in the soil, and they hold the soil together, so they prevent erosion and leaching. Another thing that mushroom mycelium does is bind heavy metals from the soil, and they actually on purpose use mushrooms in land remediation where there's been heavy metals or even radiation. Mycorrhizal fungi help plants acquire phosphorus in a very similar way to mushroom mycelium, except that mycorrhizal fungi is microscopic. So this is a picture of a mycorrhizal fungi attached to a corn root. And you can see they attach themselves to the root, and then their microscopic threads actually move out and help that corn root draw up phosphorus by bringing the phosphorus closer to the plant root. Plants can't move their roots themselves, so they rely on these fungi to move through the soil and bring phosphorus to them. Mycorrhizal fungi also help soil stick together, and they inhibit erosion in much the same way as the mushroom mycelium. They protect plant immunity against pathogens in much the same way. Now, the interesting thing is 80% of land plants are actually mycorrhizal host plants. Now, there are some things in your soil, you probably have mycorrhizal fungi in your soil already, but there's a couple of things that inhibit it and will make it die back. One is leaving the land bare. So if you strip your garden of all the plants in the winter and don't put anything growing there, then you will have fewer mycorrhizal fungi in your soil because the mycorrhizal fungi need a host. Brassicas like kale and broccoli and cauliflower, and chenopod's like beets and lamb's quarters and arac are not mycorrhizal fungi host plants. Also, tilling with a rototiller breaks the mycorrhizal fungi bonds, and it disrupts the colony. And then the other thing is, if you have high levels of phosphorus in your soil, then plants don't look for that mycorrhizal fungi cooperation, and so that can reduce your mycorrhizal fungi populations as well. Before planting, you will always add additional finished compost to your garden. So if this is the first year you did that lasagna gardening over the winter and it's the first time you've planted that bed, you don't need to add anything else. It's ready. But then the next year when you go to that bed that you started last year, before you start planting in it, you're going to want to add some finished compost because you're going to want to keep that fertility and you're going to want to continue to build that soil. And compost is the main thing that organic gardeners use to build soil and increase organic matter. And then when you grow plants in that, they're going to take up some of that organic matter in their own roots. And so you always want to keep adding more. You're also going to want to add some worm castings. Now, if you went ahead and threw some red wigglers or some earthworms into your compost pile when you made the compost, then you've already got those worm castings when you add the compost and you don't have to worry about that again. But if you didn't, then you might want to add some worm castings. Now, worm castings are rich in organic matter and they're also rich in nutrients. They're one of the best sources of nutrients for your plants. Kelp meal or seaweed, I mentioned adding like bull kelp into the garden. They add trace nutrients that you don't often get with other fertilizers, so they're a really good thing to add. I like to add a scoop of kelp meal into my plants when I transplant anything. Anytime I transplant, I add a little bit of kelp in because it has a trace nutrients. It inhibits transplant shock, so it gives the roots a really good start to get going after transplanting. You might also want to add things like fish meal or blood meal or even urine. Because these are all high in nitrogen. You might want to add biochar, and we're going to talk about how to make biochar and what it does a little bit later. But biochar is a host for the microbes that are in the soil. Or you might want to add some wood ashes, especially if you're growing things like beets or carrots. They thrive with wood ash that helps them to grow better. Potash, phosphorus in the form of bone meal or phosphate rock is also good to add if you haven't already added it, especially if you noticed that your plants aren't flowering very much or that they're not growing well. Phosphorus is sometimes what's lacking. And of course, you can always do a soil test. And if you do a soil test, you will get recommendations for nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. That's all that a soil test generally tells you, but it can give you some idea of what your soil is lacking if you've been having trouble growing in the past. If your vegetables are growing fine, you don't need to do a soil test. And then as the season progresses, there will come a point where your plant growth slows down. And that can mean that you are lacking nitrogen in the soil, or it can mean that the temperatures aren't quite right. And we're going to talk in the next module about some ways to mediate the temperature. But in this module, I want to talk about how to kickstart things that kind of stop if the problem is fertility. So you can add quick fertility by making compost tea, comfrey tea, or manure tea. And in all these cases, what that means is you take a gallon bucket or larger and you throw in a big scoop, like maybe 2 cups or a shovelful, either fresh manure, already done compost, or even some comfrey leaves. Chop them up, throw them in, put a lid on that, and let it sit at least for 3 days so that it starts to break down and decompose. You can even come back after a week and then take the lid off, and then you want to just pour out the liquid from that. You can fill it back up again and do it again with, ferment it again. But take that liquid and then use that liquid directly on the plants. You can use it as a foliar feed, which means you put it in a spray bottle and spray the leaves, or you can pour it at the root zone of the plants, and that will get your plants growing again. Now let's talk about biochar. So what is biochar? Well, first of all, what does it do? It increases the microorganisms in the soil. They found some soils in the Amazon that had a thick layer of biochar, and those soils were fertile for centuries. They never needed any additional inputs of nitrogen or phosphorus. The biochar and the microorganisms that were in the biochar prevented the loss of nutrients in the soil. And as I said, it actually persisted for hundreds of years. Biochar improves plant growth. It also slows down the removal of soil nutrients through leaching. It holds them into the soil. It increases the soil holding capacity of the organic matter that's resident in the soil. It also increases the water holding capacity so soils don't dry out as quickly. The key to biochar, though, is that it needs to be charged with organic matter before it's added to the soil. Kind of like a battery, it has to be filled. And in the case of biochar, you want to fill it with organic matter. Biochar is basically charcoal that's being charged with organic matter. Bio meaning life, and char is charcoal. So if you have a wood stove in your home, you can make biochar right in your wood stove just simply by getting the wood going and then putting down the damper overnight. In the morning, when you open it, the biochar or the charcoal would normally catch fire again, and you need to take it out and stop that by getting it wet. Then you let it dry out, and then just before you put it in the garden, you just break it up into a powder and give it a week of sitting either in some manure or some finished compost just to get that charged with microorganisms, and then you just spread it out in your garden. Soil building is the most important thing you can do to grow a great garden. In this lesson, you learned how to increase the organic matter in your soil. You learned how to create the perfect soil conditions for quick growth. You learned which soil amendments you should add each spring for gardening success. And you learned briefly how to use biochar for long-term fertility. Here's your homework. Think about, based on what you learned in this module, what one thing can you do this year to improve your garden soil? And then I want you to leave a comment on this lesson, either here or go over to the Facebook page and leave a comment and let us know what your one thing is that you're going to do to improve your garden soil this year. In the next lesson, you're going to learn how to use mulch to mediate your soil temperatures, what kind of mulch to use and in what circumstances, how to heat the soil in early spring faster and easier, and how to create a hotbed, how to cool the soil quickly in the heat of the summer. I'll see you in the next lesson.